first we're going to look at the recipe and do a little basic math, because math is in everything, and knowing your way around a fraction is very important in cooking. This is a recipe I've been using for years. It's from my culinary school, and I have found it to be quite good. You will see that it typically makes 2 loaves, and there's no way that Kent and I are eating 2 loaves of bread, and to be honest, that just feels a little wasteful with the limited supplies that we have. So we're going to cut it in half, and this is where the math comes in. Most of the things are pretty easy to cut in half, except perhaps for 2 1/4 cups warm water. So now's the time to grab your kids and explain fractions if they are ready to do that or have struggled with understanding fractions. 2 1/4 cups. I'm going to show you how easy it is to find half of 2 1/4 cups. So you start out with 2 1/4. You want to make this into a simpler, easier to use number. So you're going to take 4 times 2, which is 8, and add 1, and it becomes 9/4. That's a much prettier fraction to work with. You want half of that, so you're going to say half times 9/4, which is 9/8. Now, most people are probably not going to want to measure out 9 of a 1/8 cup, so we're going to then make it a nicer, easier to use fraction. 8/8 would be 1. With 8/8 you'd have a remainder of 1/8, so it's 1 1/8. We go back and we say, does this make sense? Well, half of 2 is 1, and half of 1/4 is 1/8, so yes, 1 1/8 is the new measurement. So, boop, 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 1 1/8 cup. Half of half is 1/4. Half of 2 is 1. Half of 3 is 1 1/2, and we'll talk about how you use 1 1/2 eggs. 1/2 of a half again is 1/4. Half of 1 is just a half. 7 to 8 cups. This is a very vague measurement, and you're going to get a sense of how much you need when you're doing it. So to simplify, I said 3 to 4 cups. Really, if we were being exact, we would say 3 1/2 to 4 cups. You probably won't need the 4 cups. I usually don't need the larger amount. And then we have over here for the egg wash, it said 3, and so I said 1 1/2, which is great because we have 1 1/2 eggs here, 1 1/2 eggs over here, and 1 1/2 plus 1 1/2 is 3. So all we need for this recipe to make 1 loaf is 3 eggs. All right, so now that we've done our math, we're going to preview the recipe, which you always want to do when you're making something to make sure you have the materials that you need. So the first step is we're going to combine water, sweetener, and yeast, let it sit till foamy. Then we're going to add in eggs, butter, salt, and flour and knead it. That means mix it up with our hands for 10 minutes. Then we're going to let it sit in a nice little bowl for an hour. We're going to come back, break it up into 6 smaller balls. We're going to make a braid because it is a braided loaf. We're going to put it aside. It's going to have a second rise of 40 minutes. Then we're going to cook it in the oven. Whoops. 30 to 40 minutes. We're going to do a little egg wash at the end and let it cool. So you're talking about 2 long rises. It's 3 to 4 hours for the whole process, but it's not a lot of active time. It's a lot of just letting it sit and wait time. So I'll typically do this while I'm cooking a bunch of other things and just check in as needed. It is a scenario where you want a good timer to remind you to come back and do the next step. So we'll come back in a moment to do the first step. Okay, so we're back, and one thing I wanted to do before we do our first step is to go over our ingredients and make sure we have everything we need. Which is always something you want to do before you start to execute a recipe. So we're going to need warm water, honey, dry yeast, eggs, butter, sea salt, all-purpose flour, and that's it. So we have all those things. Our first step is going to be in a small bowl, combine water, sweetener, and yeast. Allow to sit about 10 minutes until mixture is foamy. One trick to this is that the water should be warm, approximately 110 degrees, so we're going to look at that first. We are ready to do our first full part, which is combining water, sweetener, and yeast, and letting sit for 10 minutes until foamy. The water I initially boiled and then let cool. They want it to be 110 degrees per the recipe. Mine is currently 120. That's fine. You know what warm feels like. You don't actually need to measure. It shouldn't be hot. It shouldn't be cold. It should be warm. But just for the sake of demonstrating, I wanted to get it in the right neighborhood. I'm just using a candy thermometer here. There are two places in the recipe where you might want to measure temperature. This is one, and then at the end in terms of determining if the bread is done. So we have our water at the right temperature. Also, the yeast is a little funny because you want 1 tablespoon and a packet. I'll just show you here. Boop, 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 boop. Here we go. A packet is 2 1/4 teaspoons. I don't know who that measurement is good for, but it was not good for me. Another math moment here. 2 teaspoons to a tablespoon. A tablespoon is what we need. This packet contained 2 1/4 teaspoons, so we need another 3/4 of a teaspoon. And the way I would measure that out, the easiest way for me is 1/2 teaspoon plus 1/4 teaspoon altogether. That is 3/4, which is like 2. It's not, you have to open 2 packets if you have these packets, but then you still have like the better part of a packet left behind. So that's annoying. But anyway, I've measured out our yeast and our sweetener. In this case, we went with a 1/4 cup of honey, and then we're gonna add our warm water. And I'm adding the warm water to the honey to kind of melt it, to get it out of my cup a little more easily. You always want to think ahead about how to be as lazy as possible. And that makes cleanup a little easier. So we're going to combine these. I'm just using a random knife because that's what I have here. And we're going to let that sit for 10 minutes until foamy. So we're going to set a timer and we'll come back. Alright, welcome back. So we have let our yeast mixture get foamy, like so. Basically the yeast eats the sweetener, the sugar, and that's what allows it to expand, which is what allows your bread to rise. We're going to add eggs, butter, salt, and just enough flour to create a dough that pulls away from the sides of the bowl. So we start with our mixture that we had, and then we have our eggs, and I already threw the salt in there. And then we have the butter, which was melted, but we don't want it too hot, because eggs and hot butter don't do well together. So we have all of those components mixed up. And what I did with the 1 1/2 egg scenario is I broke open 3 eggs, beat that together, and then cut it into 2 portions. The 1 1/2 that we're going to use on the front end, and the 1 1/2 that we're going to use on the back end. So that is how we worked out 1 1/2 eggs. So then I'm going to actually take this and move it to a bigger bowl. And we're going to start adding the flour, and we're just going to do that until it is the right consistency. They predicted that it should be 3 1/2 to 4 cups. So I'm going to start with 3. Ish. Not an exact science. Right, and I will come back when we get to the next stage. Okay, so you have your dough, and it's kind of pulling away from the bowl at this point. What you want to do is have a fairly big surface that is clean and dry because you're gonna start working your dough. So we're gonna knead the dough on the table for about 10 minutes or until a soft dough has been created. This looks like a good amount of flour to me. I would say I have an extra cup, maybe cup and a half that I've laid out, and I'm gonna pour my dough. It could be, I could have added a little more dough in the bowl, but I kind of like to feel it and work with it when I'm kneading the dough. So I'd rather it be a little on the wetter side when I pour it out to work with it, if that makes any sense. And it smells yeasty and lovely. And we're gonna just wrap it in flour at first so it doesn't stick too much. I do have a little boo-boo, so I have a very brightly colored Band-Aid. You want to do that so that if, God forbid, it gets lost in the dough somewhere, you can find it easily so that someone doesn't end up eating a Band-Aid.
Ew.
Thank you, Kent. Alright, so we're going to work on this for a few minutes, and then we are going to put it in a large, clean, lightly oiled bowl and cover it with plastic wrap. I'll probably just use beeswax sheet. And we're going to proof it, that means to let it rise, in a warm, quiet place for 45 to 60 minutes or until dough has doubled. So that means that you don't play loud, crazy music or put it in a room with screaming people. You let it have a nice, quiet, meditative rest period so that it can grow big and fluffy and strong. So we'll come back when all of that is done in about an hour. Thanks. Okay, so we're back after an hour. I had put the dough in a lightly oiled bowl and covered it with a wax sheet and a towel, and it has doubled in size as it is supposed to do. And now we are going to gently punch dough down about 10 to 15 strokes and then cut into 6 equally sized balls. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. We're just kind of pushing out some extra air. 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. Alright, so I have one thing that needs to be made into 6 equal parts, so I'm going to cut it in half and then in thirds. Two, 3, 4, 5, 6. So I'm going to look at them, see if they look like they're approximately the same size. These are going to be the strands of the challah that you will braid together. And they look pretty close, so you have different options for braiding. There's a 3-strand braid, 4-strand braid, 5-strand braid, 6-strand braid. I usually try to do the 6, but it never looks as pretty as I would like it to. But this is what it looks like. It's a rather complex looking diagram. So I'm gonna get it going and then we'll see how it goes. Okay, so you take each of your 6 balls and you roll them out into logs and you attach them at the top, and then you start with the braid, which is always confusing to me. So we're going to call them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 starts by going over 1. I feel like I never have them tight enough to make this pretty, but that's that. Then 2 goes over 6. This is 2. Goes over 6. Kind of a sticky proposition. 1 goes over 3. 5 goes over 1. 6 goes over 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm much better with 3 strands. 3 strands is like a basic hair braid. Then you begin the sequence again of 2 over 6. 1 over 3. 5. Oh no! Over 1. 6 over 4. I'm gonna try to clean this up a little bit and we'll come back. Okay, so this is my messy braid. It'll look okay once it's baked. So, our next move after doing the braid is to loosely cover. I'm going to use the beeswax sheet again, put it in a warm, quiet place, and let it rise again for another 40 minutes. And towards the end of that time, I'll preheat the oven to 350 because we'll finally bake. Alright, so after braiding, we let the dough rise again, and now we are going to bake it. Your oven should be preheated to 350, and we're going to bake it for 30 to 40 minutes until dough is golden and firm to touch. And a few minutes before it's done, we will put on the egg wash. So we'll see how that goes. Alright, we're probably about 5 minutes prior to being done. So we're going to pull our loaf out and do the egg wash. So that is the remaining 1.5 eggs whipped up. And that is the pretty little glaze. You have a pastry brush, a silicone brush like this. It's definitely an easier job. You want to get in your little nooks and crannies. It will look much prettier if you get it all done. And you're not going to use all of the egg that they called for, that's fine. And it's going to go in for another 5 minutes, I think. And then we should be good. Alright, I think it should be done at this point. Let's take a look. By sound and smell, I feel pretty good, but I'm gonna double check the temp. We want between 190 and 205. And I think it's gonna hit right around 200, so we're good. So let me pop that out, and you're gonna let it cool. The braid was a little loose, which is why it doesn't look as pretty as it probably should, but I guarantee it will still be tasty. So that is challah. Thanks.